Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Voice of the New Human. My name's Kelly Attwood, and today we have a multifaceted, multi-talented, multi-dimensional wizard in the house. His name's Paul Perfrement. A little bit about Paul. Paul has a background as a therapist. He is a counsellor trainer and an educator in the areas of healing and spiritual emergence. Paul also specialises in living from soul. Paul and his wife Stephanie deliver an internationally accredited diploma course in soul development. That one's called How to Live, Relate and Create from Your Deepest Self. So without further ado, welcome, Paul.
Hello, Kelly. How are you today?
Well, great after all those little technical little issues that we had, but I think we're ready to go now. What do you reckon?
Oh, we have none at this end.
Oh, so glad we got through them. So today we're going to be talking about, well, first of all, a little bit about you. I know you're shy, Paul, but I think you can come out of your shell just a little bit. And what I'd love to share with the audience is just a little bit about your background, even going back as far as when you were a child, what type of child you were, and how you, I know this is going back a while, then moving into your teen years, and what sort of created the man that you are today, and you know, what led you into teaching what you teach?
Yeah, wow.
That's big.
I hadn't expected you to ask me that kind of question, so I'll just have to think myself through that a little bit. But basically, I grew up in Sydney, and I was born in Sydney. My mum and dad were an intact relationship, although there was a lot of tension there that my dad had an alcohol difficulty. And I don't know how much to say about all of that, but basically my background was pretty tough, but it was also a very good background. Some would say, oh, there's nothing wrong. You know, you have a fine background. So yeah, I grew up in suburban life in Sydney. And from an early age, I had some difficulties with my back because of the way I had a congenital back problem when I was born. And so I was seeing natural healers from a young age, particularly because I played a lot of sport. And in my early time, seeing those healers, I became really impressed with their generosity and their connection and quality of work that they did. Yeah. And, you know, I guess I had such a difficulty with my back that we had an osteopath that would see me regularly without charging my dad. And I was seeing him several times a week. And yeah, I learned a lot from the natural therapists that I guess initiated my well-being.
Right back from when you were young. And I guess you could say, Paul, that you came from, I mean, I know quite a bit about codependency or codependence, you know, with my background. So we come from similar backgrounds, you could say. So we've had to really work at understanding who we are underneath the labels and roles that we've played as young adults, you know, throughout our 20s and so on. Would you say that's true?
I'd say it's very true. I think I came in with a lot of sensitivity. I think I came in with a sensitive nervous system, a very alive kind of nervous system, in the sense of it being picking up things that you couldn't really convey to other people, and being different from my father, I think, was, and even my mother, was particularly difficult for me, I think, in some ways. Having to come to terms with a kind of a reality that others didn't know or share. Yeah.
So your reality, can you explain how your reality was different from your parents?
Yeah, well, I just had a different experience of what the world was like. I remember saying to my mother at a young age while she was preparing dinner, when I grow up, Mum, I'm not going to live like this. And she said, well, what do you mean? I said, well, I'm not going to live in a house and in square buildings.
Yeah.
And she said, well, what will you live in? And I said, I don't know, maybe a teepee. So, but I guess there's these links we have to other realities or other times
Yeah,
when
yeah.
what we've been through. And I know in my own sort of times of waking up a little bit in my own sense of self and spirituality, I've been very enthused by things like the Native American tradition and Indigenous pathways, and in fact had that spontaneously happen for me, that I started to experience things that weren't really very explainable, certainly not to my parents. And fortunately, I had a lady that I saw who was a healer, who did past life therapy and psychotherapy. And she validated a lot what that was going on for me as I started to open up quite radically at a certain point in my 20s.
Early 20s, yep.
Early 20s, and it started all kind of just things just weren't fitting anymore, and I was ready for some major transformation to take place.
Yeah.
I'd been meditating for a while, and suddenly certain things were happening that weren't really in the normal terms of this reality, this ordinary state of consciousness.
So just to even meditate back in those days, back in the early 1800s, it would have been unusual, I guess, in most circles for anyone to be meditating. And even, if I go back 20 years ago, it was still very unusual. Today, lots of people meditate. So for you to actually, what triggered you to go and meditate? There must have been some experience.
Well, I grew up in Catholic upbringing, and the priest would always say that we should be following God and honouring that connection, but no one ever told us how to do it. So I just started to get books on meditation and tried to do it myself. When I was at university at the age of 18 or 19, I learned TM, had a proper TM kind of initiation and instruction, and used TM for a while.
Yes.
Transcendental meditation, for those people not familiar with that term. And that, I think, started to really kick things off. I tended to meditate twice a day for about 20 minutes. And then it wasn't too long before I started to experience, just every time I closed my eyes to meditate, I would experience, basically flashing light in my head. Just started to, which is one of the hallmarks of what they say happens to people who are opening into a shamanic reality. Light in the head is a feature of that kind of awakening.
Yes.
And it was a feature part of my own opening up and growing. I started to hear things at night, like drumming in the bushland beside our house. Go and find the drumming. There was no one there, things like that. There were crossing realms. And at the same time, I was training at that time to be a psychologist. I became a psychologist and didn't really seem to operate much as a psychologist because I had these other areas of expertise that had started to develop, especially having spent time with the world's leading, most recognised shaman as a trainer, Michael Hana, the author of The Way of the Shaman and Cave and Cosmos, and also representing for some years as a psychologist and a therapist the work of Dr. Stanislav Grof and his wife Christina Grof, who wrote a stack of books on a different model of consciousness that reflected Jung's work, but also extended our sense of, what realms we can capably enter into through various methods like meditation or drumming, those sorts of things. And of course, what happens, people come to see you with those sorts of difficulties that you yourself have encountered, your own awakening process that you're trying to deal with, your own codependent issues that you're trying to clean up and sort out and get clear about, and the non-ordinary states of consciousness, which people like Michael Hana call a shamanic state of consciousness.
And so I'm not did you ever practice as a psychologist, Paul, or did you jump ship pretty early on in the piece?
Well, I was working as a healer and as a counsellor before I became a psychologist. And then I was a psychologist and registered as a psychologist and teaching people counselling. And then eventually I just felt very at odds with the profession and its limitations and the sorts of models that you had to work within. So my work has incorporated the tremendous value of a lot of traditional counselling and psychotherapy and psychological theory, but it also has opened to including the work of Michael and Stan and these great pioneers of therapy and consciousness that we have in the West.
Yeah, and also the pioneers of, what spiritual emergence is all about. And I think, maybe if, we can get some sort of an explanation of what spiritual emergence really entails, so our audience can understand whether they've had these experiences themselves, so that they can relate to it.
Thanks, Kelly. Yeah, sure. I mean, I think it's important, we just mentioned these pioneers. I'll just also mention John Mack, the author of the work of, he was a psychiatrist from Harvard University, and he wrote the book Abduction and Passport to the Cosmos, and certified people that had been said to have experienced abduction experiences, UFO encounters and extraterrestrial contact as being completely sane. So I actually met and spent some time with John, and ended up having people come to me as clients that didn't know I knew about that, and found themselves in the room saying, I'm having these sorts of experiences. These things have happened to me since I was a child, and all of that. Usually these people are in that liminal in-between world of like trying to deal with their ordinary lives and ordinary reality, and having these non-ordinary states permeate their world, sometimes intrude in their world. Sometimes they're beautiful experiences, and sometimes they're traumatizing experiences, because the sorts of things that happen are outside of their terms of reference. Yeah, so that's more or less what happens when people are starting to awaken. They, even though their growth and healing might be gradual, a spiritual emergence is really an opening that is an encounter with non-ordinary states, the collective unconscious, realms of experience that don't just fit our normal ego reality. And they have to go through a kind of a questioning process of, who am I? What is real? How do I come to terms with all these experiences I'm having? How do I still live my life? And where am I meant to be? And what am I meant to be doing? So it's an opening to that something more. There's spiritual emergence and there's spiritual emergency, which is a crisis in that kind of awakening process. Yeah. So all of that work is credited to people like Christina and Stan Grof, who wrote the initial books that alerted people to the fact that these people aren't not necessarily psychotic, that are having what appear to some conventional psychologists and psychiatrists as hallucinations and delusions and things like that, because there's real meaning in what they're experiencing, and they're prepared to work on it to integrate that.
From memory, Paul, Christina Grof was an alcoholic, and she went into some sort of, I don't know whether you would call it a spiritual emergency. It's a long time ago when I read some of her work, but was that was part of her awakening and the development of her work today?
Yeah, Christina would have to be one of the most loving people, I think, and compassionate people I think I've ever met in my life. Yeah. And her awakening process happened after she met her wife, Stan Grof, her husband, Stan Grof.
Yeah.
And I think the contact with Stan probably may have been partly responsible for the kind of openings she started to have. She started to have some difficulties. They're well documented in her book with Stan, Stormy Search for the Self. And she actually went to a friend of hers who was her lecturer, had been her lecturer, which was Joseph Campbell, of all people.
Wow.
And some people know Joseph. And Joseph recommended that she go and speak to Stan about the experiences that she was having. And one of the features of her experience that his model didn't fit at that time was the sense that people could have a latent Kundalini kind of experience open up, which she had. It took her into trauma to do with her birthing experiences when she had her children, and the terror of that and the altered states of that, to kind of try to manage the degree of energy that was coming through. Christina found herself seeking some solace and soothing through alcohol and had never been a drinker or an alcoholic by any means, and became that at that time. And obviously that resolved itself with considerable inner work over the years and support from people like Stan.
And so obviously that was to suppress the stress of the trauma that was coming through.
Very well said.
Yeah.
So
So some people may not know what Kundalini rising is. Would you like to explain that in a nutshell, Paul?
Yeah, I will. From Eastern traditions, there's the understanding that when transformation starts to take place in the body-mind, which is the psyche, but in the physical and energetic experience of awakening, it's as if a coiled up serpent at the base of the spine in the base chakra, the root chakra, starts to move up and through the chakra system. And the problems of a client as that sort of energy starts to move through correspond to wherever the energy is getting blocked, as it tries to free itself into a full energy flow up and over, up the back and down the front. And we've got a whole lot of literature on that from the East, but we've also got good writings on it in terms of people like Lee Sanella, who was an ophthalmologist. And when my own opening experience was happening, I was having difficulty reading. I'd look at something and it goes blurry straight away. And if I blinked, it would come back to clear again. And I had my eyes tested and there was no eye problem.
Yeah.
But Lee, in his book, Kundalini, Psychosis or Transcendence, says that as the energy comes down, it disturbs the visual pathways, the nerve pathways to do with vision. And until it settles, your eyesight's weird. Yeah. So that's the kind of thing you can have. There's a host of countless types of symptoms that people can have with a Kundalini awakening, but basically it's a very, very strong experience of awakening. In the West, we don't tend to try to awaken that way.
Yeah.
We've been brought up to be more, I suppose, heart-centered and ego-grounded. And Western psychotherapy, including Jungian psychotherapy, differs in the view that we should just be awakening that energy, because the Western psyche has to come to terms with the ego in a different way to the Eastern psyche. So we have problems as soon as we start to do Eastern practices like mantra meditation and which I mentioned earlier.
Oh, Kundalini yoga, people are trying to encourage this, probably not with a full understanding of what could potentially occur.
Yeah. So that's Kundalini. It's one of the dimensions of spiritual emergence. It's one of the categories, you could say, of a type of spiritual emergence.
What other spiritual emergences do you experience with the common Western person? What would be the most common types?
The most common type is what came from the work of people like John Weir Perry, called activation of the central archetype, which is the activation of the self, which is that part of the center of the psyche. Jung said there's two centers to the psyche. There's the ego, which is the totality of our awareness, and there's the self with a capital S. And the self with a capital S is the central archetype. That's that part of us that links to our dream world, the collective unconscious, as Jung called it. All those realms of archetypal experiences that humanity has as a common reservoir of experiences through the psyche. Yeah. It's hard to speak of these things simply because they are complex things. Yes. The psyche is both simple and complex.
Yes, and different people have different ideas of what the self is. And I mean, would you say that the self is the soul, or is the self underneath the soul, or is it on top of the soul? Or
You're asking some wonderful questions today, aren't you?
Oh, yes.
Very, very helpful to kind of, it's sort of like transpersonal psychology 101 we're doing at the moment as we talk together. Well, as I mentioned, Jung said there's two cells, two centers of consciousness, or two centers in the cell. You often see the self written as a small s or a large s. Yeah? So the small s one is the ego, the large s one is what's often termed as the self, which Jung said the closest explanation for the self is like our connection to spirit, being spirit-centered, right? Being open to all the realms of consciousness that humanity can access if we're open, yeah. And yet we need the ego to be able to be in this 3D reality and negotiating time and space in this world and being able to have a sense of identity that is strong enough. Because the great problem with spiritual emergence is that if the ego is not strong enough, you don't have an adequate container to manage those energies that want to move through, you know.
I would concur, and say also even your physical body, Paul. If it's not healthy, you wouldn't be able to contain it either.
That's right. You can go through some fairly solid physical experiences in a psychological and psycho-spiritual awakening.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And where
the body needs to be able to handle that.
Sorry.
Yeah. I said the body needs to be able to handle that.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
I was just going to add to that, where does the higher self come into play there?
Well, you could say, simply put, the higher self is the self.
Yeah.
You know. Yeah.
So that would be more of a new agey term, would you say?
Yeah.
Yeah.
In some ways,
others might call it the wise self or the observer self. There's different terms.
Yeah. Well, you know, if you're doing an exercise of trying to become more integrated and harmonious with your inner selves as in the ego level, you might be talking to your achiever, your perfectionist, your nurturing mother, nurturing father self, the vulnerable child. Yeah, these are aspects of the ego. Yeah. Although child, it gets complex because the term the child is also often considered an archetype. But we have our own personal biographical in this life kind of child too, that's part of the personality. So they're one dimension, and then you've got this other dimension, which is you talk to those different selves to integrate them in an appropriate and a therapeutic way. And you're the person that's relating to each of those. So that's the ego, right? And then if you imagine getting out of the chair, standing behind yourself, and you might put your hands on imagine yourself putting your hands on your shoulders, and you're looking around at that from that higher view, that eagle's view of that whole territory, which includes the ego self that's sitting in the chair, the identity in the chair. That's the self and the higher self. Yeah.
It's big, isn't it? It is big.
Yes. Yeah. So sometimes when people do that kind of exercise, which comes out of practices like psychosynthesis and voice dialogue therapy and other ego development therapies, which, as I say, we need that strong ego. It's not a resistant ego, it's a healthy ego. We have the term higher self, but when we step into that position, we start to get more insight into the whole process, a bigger and deeper and more profound understanding of it all. Yeah.
Yeah, I guess because that higher self is not there to judge. It's there to maybe understand the judge or the critique or the parts of yourself that are creating havoc in your life. I mean, I've experienced a lot of this. Actually, an exercise I used to do, I used to call it the Knights of the Round Table. And I used to sit at one end and I'd invite them all in, all the selves. And oh boy, there are a lot of them because I'm a Gemini, of course. So there's lots of us.
Yes.
Sorry, that's a silly joke, Paul.
Yes. No, I do get that.
I needed extra work, put it that way.
Yep.
But yeah, it worked very well for me, having that visualization that I was in a castle, you know, in that scenario around a table with all of the selves and understanding them all individually, trying to understand what their needs were so I could become more compassionate towards myself selves. That was a big part of my growth, 15, 20 years ago. And sometimes we need to revisit it.
Yeah, we do. And we're forced to revisit it with trauma or awakening processes. We have no option but to find our way through rather than around it or above it or being under it.
Yeah. And you might want to, while we're on that topic, maybe just talk a little bit about spiritual overriding and how that can cause more issues rather than allowing yourself to be present to what's happening.
Yeah, spiritual, like things like grandiosity, spiritual bypassing or overriding, as you call it. Basically, that's our refusal to feel, our refusal to be prepared to be confronted with what's coming up from within us. So there's a lot of attitudes these days about being positive and, you know, and being mindful, which are witnessing states. They're good. They can be useful techniques because it can give people a sense of being able to get a bit of distance and perhaps self-regulate the difficult things that are happening for themselves by getting enough distance from it. But ultimately, you have to work things through, which means face and be with the feelings, attend to the vulnerability, and learn how to regulate yourself with the experiences that are going on so that you actually don't find yourself just shutting off a whole realm of really what you have to come to terms with in being human. Yeah. And the more sensitive we are, the more we face. You know, the sensitive people face more.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I know you're one of those. I'm a sensitive person and my family members are as well. And, you know, part of, you know, the work that I do is assisting people who are sensitive and because they are so sensitive, they end up self-medicating, whether it's with alcohol, drugs, shopping,
any obsession
at all. And so maybe you could touch on, you know, what advice you would have for highly sensitive people that are trying to cope with what's going on in the world right now, because a lot of them don't even realize that they're going through trauma and, you know, their nervous system is hyperactive and they're tired all the time. You know, they're exhausted and they don't understand why they're so exhausted.
Yeah, I mean, obviously some people have done some really good work in this area. We may not get into details about that today, but I think the main thing, Kelly, when we start with these sorts of areas, the sensitive person has such a big journey to deal with the feeling-based and emotional side of who they are. Yeah. And often they're not easily understood by people. So they do tend to have backgrounds where people didn't get them. Yeah. And for the average kind of person, the less sensitive type of person, that's probably less of an issue. But for a sensitive person, the difficulties in their development are often relational, they're often feeling-based, but they tend to avoid that area because it's the area they feel less capable in. Yeah, they tend to have exceptionality in some ways. They tend to be gifted in certain areas, but they don't have a good grasp normally of how to manage themselves in relationships and with their own feelings.
Yeah.
And I think the first thing that they have to do is they have to get on that train of understanding themselves better and accepting themselves for who they are and finding that kind of state of becoming at peace with who they are. Yeah, and that's often a big journey.
And because they are usually quite different, it would be about embracing all of those parts of themselves that are different, because they've grown up being taught that that's not okay, whether it's by their religion or society or their family. So it's like, you know, we're all sort of constantly learning self-love on a deeper level, and it's a big journey for the sensitive person.
Yeah. And And if they're opening up a lot, they have no idea who they are or where they're at. And they tend to be unable to voice it, unable to convey it in normal terms and not normal language as well. It's difficult for them to process, even mentally, what their experiences are, what they need. So that it's hard to get help.
How do you meet them at that point when they don't have the language, that they just can't put it in the English language, for instance, because we probably may not even have the words?
Yeah, I suppose this is where you can encourage, or I sometimes, I'm not always there. I'm not pretending to be an expert in this field, but, I've worked with clients for about 30 years or more, I suppose. We try to link into where they're coming from. We try to link into what their experience is, and we try to help them to be able to be with that and to see how that might be best expressed. So there could be an image, or there could be a movement, or there could be a feeling. Yeah, we help them to connect. Often drawings and imagery is better than words.
Sure. Yeah.
Yeah. Also, when we listen deeply, when we're self-centered in our listening, we also intuit a fair bit of what's going on. So you can quite often say, is it a bit like this? Yeah. We tend to download what the other person has going on and share a little bit of that, and as a bit of a starter to helping them to be able to convey what they don't feel they're likely to be understood about. Yeah. So, yeah, I don't know if that's an adequate answer, but it's about the individual. It's about where the individual's at and trying to link into that.
It's almost like you're working from the right brain rather than left brain, because that's language versus working on, the creative side for expression, to allow them to really express out what's going on for them, which is very healing. And I know your wife, Stephanie, does that type of work.
Yeah.
So hopefully I'll get to interview Stephanie in the future about how that helps her clients. So I'm just for a lot of people, we mentioned about soul journey and highly sensitive people and how they are a little bit different normally to the rest of the family. They may be even called the black sheep of the family, like me. But have you got any suggestions on how the highly sensitive person can cope being unique in their family? Because sometimes they can block who they really are.
I think the highly sensitive person is often the receptacle for the unresolved issues in a family. So getting a bit of an understanding of what actually belongs with themselves and what belongs with the other, maybe the person they're with, maybe their family issues, and recognizing that their own reality is valid, and that they have a right to open into that experience and feel like they themselves have to discover who they are rather than who they've been told they are, which is often negative. Or alternately, with some of them, they might be overly praised and lived through by one of the parents because of their giftedness. And then they have to open out to the full realm of not what they've had admired, but also, their areas of vulnerability and difficulty, their emotional world, as I said, and come into themselves.
So they've taken
because
on
they have to leave so much.
Because they've taken on a role. You said they might be high achievers, so they may then become the hero of the family, or the savior of the family's name, whatever it is, and going out into the world you know, not as their true self, which can be sabotaging as they grow older, because let's say if they're an athlete, and then they've operated in the world as an athlete or a wonderful academic, then suddenly, I don't know, we grow older, don't we? And this is why I guess we see some former athletes, whether it's swimmers, whoever it might be, they suddenly get addictions because they can no longer do what they were doing and get their sense of fulfillment through that. They don't know who they are anymore. They don't know how to feel good. So, yeah. So I think what we might do, Paul, is perhaps another video just on the shadow self and the roles that we carry, and the archetypes, which would be great to delve into this on another level. So if you're open to that, I'd love to explore that further with you.
Good, Kelly.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you for your questions today.
Pardon?
Thank you for your questions today.
Yeah, look, it's been great talking to you. And I really think that my audience is going to get a lot out of the recommendations, and it really normalizes their experience at the end of the day. So without further ado, hopefully we'll see you soon. Thanks so much for today, Paul.
I've appreciated it. It's been lovely to talk to you.
Likewise. Bye for now.